Welcome to the Fort Lee Museum. We wanted to do a virtual tour of the museum because due to the coronavirus, all borough buildings are closed to the public. I'm allowed to be here because I still work out of here, but the public can't come in to see this exhibit. Hopefully once we get the all clear, we'll open up again and you can come and see the Fort Lee Museum. We're located on Parker Avenue in Fort Lee, about a block and a half from the future home of the Fort Lee Film Commission, the Barrymore Film Center. This museum will continue to be a museum of town history. Our film collection will move and our archive will move up the street to the new Barrymore Film Center, which we hope will open October 3rd of this year. So this exhibit is called Coming Soon, the Barrymore Film Center. And what we did is we took elements of our archive on the second floor and brought them down here to give people a small taste of what's to come. Now, the Barrymore Film Center will have objects on display and exhibits where we will borrow items from as far away as Hollywood, California, as close as Astoria, Queens, and perhaps overseas as well, to tell a story about not just Fort Lee's role in film history, but the history of world cinema. So this is very centric to Fort Lee, what we have up here, and I set this exhibit up. I am not going to be designing the exhibits at the Barrymore Film Center. We have a wonderful museum designer, ISG, and we have our museum curator, Richard Kozarski, and Drake Stutzman from NYU. They're going to assist us, but this one I'm very proud of. I tried to take elements of what we had in our archive and put them on walls to display. And something very interesting happened while I did that. On this wall right here in particular, it ended up being a tribute to women filmmakers in Fort Lee, which is a good thing. One of my favorite actresses in the Fort Lee period was Theda Bara. She came to Fort Lee with the birth of Fox Studios. That's where she became a star in 1915. Her first film was A Fool There Was, which still exists. Unfortunately, most of her films were stored by Fox in a vault in Little Ferry, New Jersey. And in the mid-30s, the nitrate film exploded and destroyed all but 4 of her films, I believe. That one survives. And elements of Cleopatra, which was shot in Los Angeles, considered probably her greatest film. Most of that was lost. There's only a few seconds that survived. But these images go back to about 2014 when we were setting up the idea of doing a centennial exhibit for Fox the following year, which we did as they started in Fort Lee in 1915. So I was over at the apartment in New York City of a good friend of ours, Joe Ransky. Joe was an archivist and a film historian with the Lincoln Center Library for Performing Arts, and I was in Joe's apartment. I thought I would spend about an hour there. I ended up spending probably about 7 or 8 hours going through Joe's collection, and in a file cabinet I found all these images of Theda Bara, original images. And when I asked Joe, because these stills, originals, had black, cardboard on the back as they were pulled up, like they were pulled out of a scrapbook. And he said, well, you're gonna love this because he bought it from a collector who was friends with Theda Bara, and that was her personal scrapbook. So he allowed us to scan all those images. So these images are from Theda Bara's personal scrapbook. This, one of my favorite images from her Fort Lee period. This film called Sin was shot in 1915 at Fox Studio on Linwood Avenue and Main Street. This is a great image of Theda on set in Fort Lee for Fox. And that's a great little image of her. I like it a lot. And these images are additional images of Theda Bara. Now, Theda Bara was probably the first star that had a publicity department create a phony biography about her. William Fox hired these 2 cigar-chomping publicists to come up with a story about her birth and her life. When she was making films in Fort Lee, William Fox set her up and her mother and sister, as a matter of fact, who she's very close to, set them up in a suite of rooms on Riverside Drive in Manhattan. And he had them heavily draped. He had incense in there, snakes, and the press would come to interview her, and she would be very mystical, in these provocative outfits. But Theda Bara, off the camera, she rolled with it. She laughed out loud, and she said, could you imagine this biography? They're saying my dad was born, in the shadows of the pyramids. My mother was a Parisian, and all this other stuff. And she goes, I'm just a nice Jewish girl from Cincinnati, which she was. She was a college graduate. She took care of her mom and sister the rest of her life. No scandal, only married once to one man, the director Charlie Braben. They eventually moved to Hollywood. She was in, like I said, films for Fox out in Hollywood. The biggest was Cleopatra. And she retired from films and lived the rest of her life in Hollywood until she died in the mid-50s. And she befriended a young little girl who moved next door to her with the girl's family. And that girl wrote a book a few years ago. And the girl said, the woman said at this time, "I'm not so sure my family adopted Charlie and Theda or they tried to adopt me." But nevertheless, Theda really treated the girl like a daughter, and when the little girl had plays to do in grammar school, Theda would train her, practice with her, and when Theda Barrett died, she bequeathed all of her costumes to that little girl, who a few years ago auctioned them off for multiple millions of dollars. They just were auctioned again, and those costumes include, if you want to look right up there, that's not from Fort Lee, but I like that image so much, the Cleopatra image, because it shows to me and to other people, some people think silent films were very Victorian. That's very provocative. And that snake bra and that snake headdress just went up for auction and in December out in Hollywood, and it was quite a lot of money. Now, this was an empowered woman who controlled her career. Now, to a different woman who I'm very proud of as well, who was a different type of star in Fort Lee, Pearl White. Pearl never made any films in California. She was a cliffhanger queen, perhaps the most famous cliffhanger queen. She started in Fort Lee in 1914 with The Perils of Pauline, and she continued making films into the 1920s. And these images are great. They're from three glass slides we bought on the internet, and they're from the production of The Perils of Pauline. And you can see the scene on the edge of the Palisades where she's getting into a basket of a hot air balloon. Up until the 20s, she did all her own stunts. Well, we always heard the story that balloon drifted away by accident, and they either had to chase her to Philadelphia or New York. Well, a few years ago, 2 summers ago, I had interns from Fort Lee High School, and I told them or asked them to go through the Fort Lee Historical Society collection to see if there were any film items in there, because I knew I have a handle on what we have on our film commission archive. But we have 2 archives up there, and sometimes things get misplaced. So they actually found several audio cassettes from, I believe, 1967, Mark Tom Hanlon and Donald Mackenzie. When I saw that, I knew Donald Mackenzie was the director of The Perils of Pauline. I immediately was able to get those audio tapes digitized and into files and listen to them. And it was fantastic. Donald Mackenzie at the time in '67 was up in years, and he was living in Jersey City, and I believe Tom brought him to Fort Lee. And not only did Tom Hanlon, who was a great film historian himself from Fort Lee, and in the industry as a sound man and historian, he also interviewed 2 of Mackenzie's stuntmen who worked on The Perils of Pauline. So I don't believe this audio interview was ever heard anywhere, and we hope to put it on our next DVD set released by Milestone, with hopefully some chapters of The Perils of Pauline, and this could be an audio supplement. So it's about 40 minutes it runs. Into a half hour, I'm praying that they bring up the balloon. And finally, Tom goes, "Donald, tell us about the balloon and Pearl White." And it was about a 15-minute discussion. And it laid to rest the story about Philadelphia. But in fact, the balloon did drift away over the Hudson. Mackenzie sent those 2 stuntmen and a crew down Route 5 in River Road. They took a ferry and they chased that balloon to Brooklyn. They set up a communication shack at Brooklyn Borough Hall, so Mackenzie could get word, because he stayed on set on the Palisades. And eventually that balloon drifted and landed into an older woman's front lawn in Canarsie section of Brooklyn. And at that point, you see Pearl always wore a blonde wig when she was performing on screen, because when she wasn't performing, she liked her anonymity, because she was a big star, international star. So she used to take the wig off, and she had brown hair. Nobody recognized her. Well, when that basket landed, everybody recognized her, wig and all, and they came at her and they pulled pieces of her clothes off for souvenirs. Her wig was all pulled off, and Mackenzie said, and actually the stuntman said, by the time they got to Pearl, she was half a wreck. And Tom Hanlon asked Mackenzie, "Well, what did you do? Did you bring her back home to rest?" He goes, "No, we brought her back to Fort Lee to continue shooting." So that was a chapter in The Perils of Pauline. We heard recently that a good friend of ours from France, Serge Bromberg, through the Moscow archive, has found the missing chapters of The Perils of Pauline. And that will be great news, and we're hoping he eventually could premiere them, at least in the United States with us once the Barrymore Film Center is open. But one of the things I like to tell when we have school groups in here, specifically young ladies, I always show them this picture of Pearl White, which I don't know if you could see here, but it's her again, when the industry was in Fort Lee, it empowered women both in front of the camera and behind the camera. So you have an image of her in this cool leather jacket holding a handgun, and she's the heroine, she's the hero. That guy is doing nobody any good. He passed out, so she's protecting him. So she's really like an Indiana Jones character way before Indiana Jones. In fact, she could be the template of Indiana Jones because she was this provocative, meaning action-oriented serial queen, and what she did in front of the cameras in the 1910s is amazing, truly. So one of my favorite images of Pearl is from Cliffhanger Point. This is a production still from the 1918 film House of Hate. Now, the only existing print of this film is in the Moscow archive in Russia. Why would that be? Because the great Soviet director Sergei Eisenstein loved Pearl White's films and always imported them, and that's why they're there to this day. The Russian archivist sent us a video transfer of this film. It's fabulous. We hope to get the original elements eventually because it's a film worth seeing. This is almost like the history of early American film right here. You have Pearl White, and then you have the director of this serial, George Seitz, who ended up going to MGM, and he directed many of the Mickey Rooney, Judy Garland films for MGM in the 1930s. This cameraman, Arthur C. Miller, started out as a teenager, no relation to the playwright, and he was a teenager, I believe, from the East Coast, and he ended up going to Fox in California, and he won 3 Academy Awards for cinematography. First one was for John Ford's How Green Was My Valley, I believe 1940, then The Song of Bernadette, I believe 43, and then Anna and the King of Siam in the late 40s. And he ended up writing a book, which is out of print now, but you can get it on eBay, and I encourage you to get it. It's called One Reel a Week. And in that book, he devotes a chapter to Fort Lee, specifically about the history of Rambo's, that enabled us to save that building on First Street several years ago. This person is one of my favorites. He was a Latin romantic type lead guy in silent films from Spain, Antonio Moreno. And here he is right here. Later on, he would direct prolifically in Latin America, Mexico, Cuba even. And in the 40s, he came back to America to become a character actor. And he was in 1950s, you see him in The Searchers with John Wayne. And my favorite role of his is in the Universal Creature from the Black Lagoon, the original, where he played the professor. So I have a soft spot in my heart for him for that. And that's pretty much in 2012, it looks the same. That's Cliffhanger Point today. And we do lead walks up to Cliffhanger Point a couple of times a year. This past Thanksgiving weekend, we led about 100 people up to take a look at Cliffhanger Point. This image right here, we're getting away from Pearl White, but we're showcasing the diversity of film in Fort Lee. That's Oscar Michaud, a prolific African-American director, and this was from his last film in 1948, which he shot in Fort Lee Studios, called The Betrayal. He started in Fort Lee in 1920. He made Symbol of the Unconquered, which was a groundbreaking film that displayed the Ku Klux Klan for what they were, a racist organization. So he shot this in Fort Lee with actors dressed as Klansmen with lit torches, and in a way, this was his response to D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which was in 1915, and he portrayed the Klan, Oscar Michaud, for what they were. He couldn't make these films as a black filmmaker in Hollywood because of discrimination, but I'm very proud to say many of his films were shot in Fort Lee from 1920 to his last in 1948. He didn't see any discrimination in Fort Lee, and the people welcomed him, and he did some interesting films in Fort Lee, including talking films in 1931, and I believe Metropolitan Studios, which is where Constitution Park is now. He directed the first all-talking African-American musical called The Exile, which still exists. So we're hoping at the Barrymore Film Center to showcase his work in a bigger film festival that'll be devoted to one night or whole weekend where we show Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which is very controversial, and we'll have a panel to discuss it. Then we show his Symbol of the Unconquered, and hopefully, in a perfect world, we get Spike Lee over here to showcase his film, Black Klansman. And I think that would be a great lens to learn not only about film, but also about American history. So this is our case devoted to the Barrymores. You'll see a lot more about the Barrymores once we open up. These towers have lobby cards. This is our case devoted to William Fox, and as I said before, you'll see a lot of references to Theda Bara because she was a box office star for William Fox. So here's images of Universal. That was their second studio in Hollywood, and for a short time, that was the largest enclosed studio in America. Here is images of Carl Laemmle, the founder of Universal, and his partner Robert Cochran, breaking ground in Fort Lee. They look like Oliver Wendell Douglas and Green Acres there, but they are actually breaking ground for a huge studio. There's the champion, very proud of that. Cirque Productions produced that for us, and that was nominated for an Emmy in New York City, which we're very proud of. Here's a case devoted to Rambos, which we were able to save in large part due to Arthur Miller's book, and also Paul Garucki, a friend of ours, who had the only existing print of a film that they shot out there in 1912, Grocery Clerk's Romance. We have some artifacts. This is an artifact that was used by Universal Studios in Westerns back in the 1910s in Fort Lee. There's a sizzle reel. We have, obviously coming soon, the Barrymore Film Center. Images of our 35 millimeter camera that dates 1916, pretty much this type of camera they use in Fort Lee. We're going to go into this room briefly. This is a case devoted to Alice Guy Blaché, not only the first woman studio owner and filmmaker who owned and operated Solax Studio and built it in Fort Lee in 1912, but she's the person who created narrative film in the world. So she's very important to us, and we're very proud of Alice. We'll be doing a lot of things with Alice. This is a collection of glass slides, which were used to almost coming attractions back in the day. They were blown up on a screen, and these are all original, all Fort Lee productions. Very proud of it. And you'll see some images here from Law and Order when they were shooting here. Gary, this was a great chance for us to have production in Fort Lee. There's an image from the first popular gangster film that was shot on Main Street, and that was Musketeers of Pig Alley. Here is Mac and Mabel. They actually met. Mac sent Mabel Norman outside the Barrymore Film Center, where Mabel Norman was making her first picture for D.W. Griffith in 1911, and he had been with D.W. in Fort Lee since 1909, so very proud of that. More Barrymore material from our archive. And finally, this room dedicated to Palisades Amusement Park, and from 1910 to 1935, the owners of the park were two brothers, Nicholas and Joseph Skank. I kid you not, that's their name, Skank. Very important in the film industry. They're a business partner. It was Marcus Lowe, and in 1923-24 they formed MGM, which was on the West Coast. They put Louis B. Mayer in charge of production, but they also brought over a Fort Lee boy who at one time was managing the park for the Skanks. Eddie Max became the superintendent of MGM and was until the day he died in 1963. And the importance of Joe Skank, who started a studio in Manhattan, was he pretty much stole Arbuckle from Max Sennett, and Arbuckle brought into Skank's studio for the first time to make a film, Buster Keaton. So Keaton's career has a connection to Fort Lee, and that's an image from 1916 of Arbuckle shooting a film in Palisades Amusement Park called The Reckless Romeo. So that's pretty much a quick tour of this museum. So if you're stuck at home with this virus and quarantine, at least you can get a sense of what we have here. And I hope once we get the all clear, you can come down, and hopefully I'll be here to give you a personal tour. And certainly by October of this year, God willing, we'll be opening up the Barrymore Film Center. So I thank Cirque Productions for making this possible to do some outreach since everybody's stuck at home. Be safe, be careful. We look forward to seeing you in Fort Lee this year for the opening of the Barrymore Film Center.
The Barrymore Film Center, celebrating Fort Lee, New Jersey as the birthplace of the American film industry. Opening this October.